They thought it was an adventure, a hidden treasure in the woods. But when the doors closed behind them, they realized they were never meant to leave. Liam, Cassie, Jordan, Ethan, and Maya were on their annual camping trip deep in the Blackwood Forest. With nothing but a compass and old hiking maps, they sought out uncharted locations, hidden spots untouched by tourists. That's when they saw it. Through the thick fog of early evening, a massive Victorian mansion loomed ahead. Its towering spires and ornate balconies jutted out from the treetops as if it had been swallowed by the forest itself. "This isn't on any map," Cassie whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "Maybe it's abandoned," Ethan suggested. "Wouldn't be the first time we found an old house out here." Jordan smirked. Only one way to find out. As they approached, the air grew unnaturally still. The crickets stopped chirping. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The front door creaked open before they even touched it. Inside, a grand chandelier flickered to life, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the faded wallpaper. The mansion smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic, something wrong. "Guys, I don't think we should be here," Mia murmured, gripping her backpack straps. "Oh, come on," Liam scoffed. "It's probably just an old estate. No one's been here in ages." But as they stepped further in, the door slammed shut behind them. The echo reverberated through the empty halls. No one had touched it. Cassie pulled out her phone. No signal. "Of course," Jordan muttered. "All right, quick look around, then we head back." They explored cautiously. The mansion was massive, winding staircases, endless corridors, and rooms filled with dust-covered furniture. It was as if the house had been lived in yesterday but forgotten for centuries. Then they noticed something chilling. The layout was changing. Hallways that once led to the entrance now looped them back into the center of the house. Doors led to rooms that hadn't been there moments before. The wallpaper pulsed, shifting as if breathing. "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice shaking. "That's the problem," Ethan murmured. "I don't think we can." Panic set in. Liam tried to force open a window, but it wouldn't budge. The glass was ice cold to the touch, almost as if it were alive. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, indistinct murmurs carried through the halls, but they grew louder, more insistent. The voices weren't coming from one place, they were all around them. Jordan turned pale. "Who else is here?" Cassie pointed, trembling. "Look." At the end of the hall, a figure stood, a shadowy outline of a man, featureless yet watching. And then he stepped forward. The friends scattered. Maya and Ethan rushed down a corridor, only to find themselves back where they started. Cassie and Liam tried to pry open another door, but it led them into a room filled with mannequins, lifeless, blank faces staring at them. A record player crackled to life. A haunting lullaby echoed through the mansion, distorting as if played backward. And then the spirits appeared. Pale figures, eyes sunken, mouths twisted in silent screams. Their limbs jerked unnaturally as they reached out for the living. "We have to move," Jordan shouted. The house was toying with them, leading them in circles, breaking them down. Liam yanked open a random door, and for the first time, it showed something new, a narrow tunnel leading downward. A whisper, almost kind, filled their ears. "Run." They didn't hesitate. They plunged into the darkness, the walls closing behind them. A staircase spiraled downward endlessly until they burst out into the night, gasping, trembling, free. The mansion was gone. No trace of it remained, just the thick trees and the cold wind whispering through the branches. Maya turned to the others, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did that just—" Jordan held up his phone. The timestamp read 3 days later. Weeks later, Ethan, unable to shake the nightmare, searched old records. What he found made his blood run cold. There had been a mansion in Blackwood Forest over 100 years ago. It had belonged to a man named Alastair Crown, known for his occult practices. The mansion had burned to the ground, taking everyone inside with it. And yet, they had been there. They had walked its halls. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. A notification. A photo taken in his gallery from the night they escaped. It showed the 5 of them, standing in the woods. And behind them, the mansion, looming with its doors wide open, waiting. When Daniel and Emily moved into their dream home, they thought they were getting a fresh start. But as the days passed, strange noises echoed through the halls. Shadows shifted in the corners, and an unsettling truth began to unravel. The house wasn't empty. It had been waiting for them. The Porters had always dreamed of owning a home. After years of scraping by, saving every penny, and living in cramped apartments, they were ready for a place of their own. When Daniel saw the listing for the house on the edge of town, it felt like fate. The house was everything they had imagined. A 2-story, historic home with faded white paint and sprawling oak trees lining the yard. It seemed like something out of a forgotten storybook. The moment they saw it, Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement, and Daniel felt a tug in his chest, an overwhelming sense that this was the home they had been waiting for. The Sellers, a quiet, older couple, were anxious to move. They had lived in the house for years, but spoke little of their time there. They sold it for a fraction of its worth, too good to be true. Emily had raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Why so cheap?" she had asked. The elderly man had simply smiled, his lips thin and cracked, and replied, "The house has its quirks. It doesn't bother us. You'll be fine." Daniel, eager to begin their new life, dismissed Emily's concerns. "It's perfect. Don't overthink it. This is our fresh start." They signed the papers without a second thought. The first few nights were calm. They unpacked, rearranged, and joked about the renovations that would transform the house into something even more beautiful. Emily had a vision of what it could be: new paint, fresh furniture, curtains that would sway softly in the breeze. But beneath the excitement, a strange unease settled in. It was during those first nights that the house began to speak. It started with the creaks suspiciously loud for a house that had only stood for a century. The sound of wood groaning as if something was moving within the walls. A floorboard would squeak under a footstep where no one had been, and doors would gently sway as though a breeze had passed through, but the windows were shut tight. At first, Daniel dismissed it. Old houses settled after all. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play, something more sinister. One night, Emily woke to the faint sound of a lullaby. It was barely audible, but it sent a chill down her spine. She lay still in bed, listening, trying to pinpoint its source. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house. She turned to Daniel, his back to her, the blanket rising and falling with his steady breathing. "Daniel," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" What?" he mumbled, half asleep. "A lullaby. It's coming from somewhere in the house." Daniel groaned and pulled the blanket over his head. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But Emily couldn't. She lay there in the dark, her heart racing. The lullaby continued, faint but persistent. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic, and it was coming from the house itself. The next few nights brought more disturbing sounds. The creaking grew louder, now joined by the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing in the hallway outside their bedroom. Daniel, trying to be the protector, would leap out of bed, baseball bat in hand, searching the dark corridors. But each time, there was nothing. Nothing but the silent emptiness that stretched throughout the house. Max, their golden retriever, began to act strange. At first, he'd cower at the base of the stairs, his tail tucked between his legs. Then he refused to enter certain rooms altogether. His hackles would rise, his low growl sending a ripple of unease through the air as he stared into spaces where no one stood. On one such night, Emily was in the kitchen when Max began to bark wildly, his eyes fixed on the hallway. His growls turned into a frantic whimper as his body shook. Emily's heart pounded as she turned to see what had him so terrified. Nothing. There was nothing there, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching them. It wasn't long before Emily saw it. One evening, she stood before the large mirror in the entryway, adjusting her hair. She caught a flash of movement in the reflection, something dark, something looming. She spun around, her heart in her throat. The room was empty. The air was still. "Daniel," her voice trembled. "I saw something." Daniel entered from the living room, irritation written across his face. You're just tired. It's been a long day." "I saw something," she insisted, her voice shaking. "In the mirror, a figure just behind me." Daniel sighed, rubbing his face. "There's nothing there. Let's just get some rest, all right?" But Emily wasn't so sure. The next morning, Daniel went to the town library, determined to get to the bottom of things. The town's history was sparse, but the house, that had a darker story. He spent hours digging through old records, newspaper clippings, and town archives. And what he uncovered made his stomach turn. The previous owners had vanished, disappeared without a trace. No bodies, no notes, nothing, just gone. But that wasn't the worst part. Daniel's fingers shook as he turned the pages, reading about the other families that had lived in the house before the elderly couple. Every single one of them had vanished as well. Over the course of the last century, every family that had ever called the house home had simply disappeared. The disappearances went back as far as the town records could reach. In each case, the house had been sold at a drastically low price, only to be sold again when the next family vanished. The records were eerily consistent, always with no explanation, no sign of a struggle, no clues. Daniel felt sick to his core. Something was wrong with the house. Something was very wrong. Meanwhile, back at the house, Emily was alone when the whispers started. At first, it was only faint, just a soft murmur, like a voice carried on the wind. But as she walked through the hallways, the whispers grew louder. Then unmistakable words. "Emily, Emily." She froze, her pulse quickening. It wasn't her imagination. The voice was right behind her. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. But the air grew cold. Her breath formed visible clouds in front of her face. And then a child's laugh echoed through the walls, soft, innocent, and chilling all at once. That night, Daniel told Emily everything. The research, the history, the families that had vanished. The house had a sinister past, and it was no coincidence that they were here now. Desperate for answers, they searched the house together, tearing through every room. That's when they found a door in the basement, hidden behind a stack of old crates. The door was small, unmarked, and covered in dust. Neither of them had ever noticed it before. With trembling hands, Daniel pried it open. Inside was a room unlike any they had seen before. Symbols, crude and disturbing, were painted on the walls. A single rocking chair sat in the center, its wooden arms worn with age. The chair was moving, slowly rocking back and forth, as though someone had just left it. A cold gust of air swept through the room, and a whisper, soft, almost too quiet to hear, brushed their ears. You shouldn't have come. The basement lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness before bursting back to life. The air thickened and the walls groaned, as if the house itself was alive, angry. Suddenly, the shadows grew longer, darker. They stretched across the walls, pooling around the chair. And then, the door slammed shut. The room grew colder. The lights went out. Emily screamed. Daniel rushed to her, but before he could reach her, the shadows reached out. They moved like living things, twisting and warping, pulling them deeper into the darkness. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a tall, hollow-eyed figure with skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth split into a grotesque grin. "We never left," it whispered. And then the house swallowed them whole. The next morning, the house was silent. A for sale sign appeared on the front lawn, its wooden post weathered and old. Daniel and Emily were gone, just like all the others before them, and the house waited. When Leo Gray inherited a crumbling house from a distant uncle he had never met, he saw it as a new beginning. But he quickly realized that the house had been silent for too long, and in that silence, something had been waiting. Leo had never been close to his extended family. When the letter arrived, stating that he had inherited a house from an uncle whose name barely rang a bell, he was surprised but not enough to refuse free property. He had been struggling, working dead-end jobs and barely making rent. A house, even an old one, was a fresh start. Nestled on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, the house loomed over a barren yard, its windows dark and lifeless. The architecture was Gothic, the stone exterior stained with time. The townspeople regarded him with wary eyes as he passed, their hushed whispers making him uneasy. "Be careful in that house," an old woman warned as he picked up groceries. "Silence breeds things we were never meant to hear." Leo chuckled nervously and waved off the superstition. He was about to find out how true those words were. From the moment he stepped inside, he noticed something odd. The house was completely silent. No creaking floorboards, no distant hum of pipes, not even the soft rustling of wind slipping through the cracks. It was unnatural. At first, Leo appreciated the quiet. He had spent too much of his life in noisy, overcrowded apartments, but the stillness soon became suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat, the sound of his breath, the faint ringing in his ears. Then he started hearing other things. It began with small disturbances, keys vanishing, doors left open when he was sure he had closed them. Then came the whispers. Faint, unintelligible murmurs slithered through the air at night, stopping the moment he turned on a light. One evening, while reading in the dimly lit study, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. He turned quickly, but nothing was there. His pulse quickened. Maybe I imagined it. The following night, he woke up to the feeling of breath on his neck. He bolted upright, his room drenched in darkness. Silence pressed against him, thick and heavy. His eyes adjusted, scanning the room. That's when he saw it. A figure, barely visible against the blackness, crouched in the farthest corner. And it was watching him. Leo refused to let paranoia consume him. He blamed stress, exhaustion, his own overactive imagination. But the house had other plans. The silence became oppressive. The longer he stayed, the more he felt like he was being swallowed by it. One night, as he paced the hallway, his footsteps eerily muffled, he felt a shift in the air. The walls seemed to be listening. Then, the whispers changed. They were no longer indistinct murmurs. They were voices. "Help us. He's still here. The silence keeps him alive. Leo's blood ran cold. The voices weren't trying to frighten him. They were warning him. He dug through old records, searching for answers. What he found made his stomach churn. His uncle hadn't died peacefully. He had vanished inside the house, just like the family before him. Each time, the house would be left empty for years, its secrets locked away in its unnatural quiet. It wasn't just haunted. It was feeding. The silence was its cocoon, its hunting ground. It absorbed sound, trapping its victims in an abyss of nothingness. The moment they surrendered to the quiet, they became part of it, consumed by the thing that lived in the void between noise and nothing. Leo had to get out. But the house had other plans. As he ran for the door, the silence thickened. His footsteps dulled, his breath muted. He screamed, but no sound escaped. He felt it closing in, pressing against his skull, wrapping around his throat like invisible hands. He clawed at the door, his vision swimming. The walls began to vibrate, the whispers turning into a low, guttural growl. The entity was awake now, and it was starving. With the last of his strength, he threw himself at the window, shattering the glass. Sound flooded in the wind, the distant hum of cars, his own ragged gasps. The house recoiled, its grip loosening just long enough for him to stumble into the night. He never looked back. Leo fled the town, leaving the house behind. He never returned, never spoke of what had happened. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he wakes up in a cold sweat, straining his ears. Because sometimes he hears nothing, and he knows the house is still waiting.